We've been doing a series on the Fifth Way, which is the book I wrote years ago and is kind of the foundational concepts for what we're doing here at The Effect and have been doing for nearly 19 years now, if you can believe it. 19 years on Wednesday. And so every once in a while, it's good to revisit it, although I haven't really gone through this series for about 10 years, so it's been a while. It's good to get back into it, good for me to get back into it and revisit some of these things because it's been such a long time. I wanted to start, we've been going through we're going to be going through 6 pairs of words that are difficult words that seem to clash and contradict each other, but that are all expressions of God's love. And last week we did mercy and justice, and this week we're going to take another pair. But I wanted to lead into this discussion with just taking a step back for a minute, as I do like to do, and just ask the question, why do we do all that we do spiritually? This spiritual journey that we're on, everything that we're trying to accomplish, both by being here, being a part of this community, but also in your own lives, prayer lives, contemplative practice, hopefully, and just in your general relationships. Why do we do everything that we do? Why is it so important for us to look at Jesus from a first century Hebrew Aramaic point of view? Why is it important for us to realize that when we do that, we're seeing Jesus as a contemplative himself, as a mystic, as someone who believes that God can be experienced personally, right here, right now in this life, not in any way remote, not in any way separated by theology or doctrine or anything that we can possibly imagine. And why does it seem to be important to be a deconstructionist? Why does it seem like we have to deconstruct the faith that we were taught, the faith we grew up in, the church? Is it just to be a rebel? Is it just to be an iconoclast? Don't you love that word, iconoclast? Someone who tears down the symbols that are traditional. It's not just for those reasons. Here's the key. If we just worship Jesus as Savior, keep him on that pedestal, then we keep ourselves in a passive position. We keep ourselves in a static position. We don't change. We're asking for something to come from outside of ourselves and move us into a different place. But if we will do what Jesus actually asked us to do, exhorted us to do, which is to emulate him, to live as he lived, then we move into an active place, a transformative place. And if we're really emulating Jesus, then we can't help but move into a contemplative place, moving into that place where we also believe and have experienced God personally, in the moment, presence to presence. And if we're going to do all of that, then we're going to be developing one skill that changes everything. We're going to develop one skill that opens the door to everything else that has been promised to us, everything else that needs to happen. Ran across an article from a psychologist, doctor of psychology, a therapist, who was an atheist but converted to Catholicism and is now working still as a therapist, but also as a Catholic worship leader, and has moved his whole practice over into a faith-based practice. And he wrote this. It's a little on the long side, but I really want to see if we can get this. So just kind of bear with me, maybe close your eyes and just listen to the words. He says, "We tend to measure intelligence by visible outputs, memory, verbal skill, analytical speed. But beneath all of those is a deeper faculty, one that may make wisdom possible at all: the ability to notice thought itself, to step back from the stream of mental activity and observe it, rather than simply being carried by it. This is called metacognition, and most people never develop it seriously." So hear what he's saying? Our thoughts normally just take us. We don't even think of them as thoughts. We think of them as some sort of reality. But if we can step back and see our thoughts, become aware of our thoughts, this is the first step that changes everything. Thought, in its automatic mode, does not announce itself. It simply runs. The catastrophizing begins and the body follows into alarm before any evaluation occurs. The inner script, I'm failing. They're judging me. I have to defend myself. Plays without interruption, and we take its conclusions as facts rather than as events occurring in the mind. Metacognition is the interruption of that automaticity. Automaticity. Great word, huh? We would probably just say muscle memory. It's just something that flows and we don't even think about it. Much suffering does not begin with pain. It begins with identification. We do not merely experience a fearful thought. We become the fear. And suddenly the body is in threat response before we have paused to ask whether the fear is warranted. We do not notice shame arising. We are the shame, and we reorganize life around hiding it. We do not witness anger moving through us. We become its momentum. And then we are sending the message we cannot unsend. Psychologists call this cognitive fusion, the collapse of any distance between the observer and the thought. When fusion is total, I am a failure is not experienced as a thought passing through consciousness. It is experienced as a fact about the self. Metacognition introduces distance. Viktor Frankl put it plainly, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is the capacity to choose. The insight sounds simple, living it is not. That space does not open automatically. It has to be cultivated. We got to practice this. This is not a new discovery. Psychology rediscovered something very old and gave it a clinical name. The Desert Fathers called it nipsis, watchfulness, sobriety of mind, a practiced attentiveness to what moved within. The Stoics built an entire philosophical practice around examining impressions before consenting to them. Examining impressions before consenting to them. Cognitive behavioral therapy would later call this cognitive diffusion. Contemplative Christianity knew it as the discernment of spirits. Different vocabularies, same essential discovery. Human beings can stand in relationship to their thoughts rather than be governed by them. A child lives largely immersed in an immediate impulse. A mature person develops over time an inner witness, a reflective center that can notice what is happening internally while remaining grounded enough not to be swept away. This is not detachment. It is presence with perspective. However, self-observation practiced entirely within the self is ultimately a closed loop. You are the observer, the observed, and the beneficiary. That's valuable, but the Christian contemplative tradition points towards something different. A form of inner witness that is not finally you standing over your thoughts in a psychological watchtower, but you becoming permeable to a gaze that is not your own. The saints who seemed most free were not those who had achieved the most sophisticated self-monitoring. They were those who had leaned. They were those who had learned to see themselves as they are seen, honestly, without the distortion that self-interest introduces into all self-knowledge. That is a different enterprise than psychological metacognition, even if it travels the same early road. Observation at that depth is not self-management. It is a form of prayer. The inner witness, practiced, deepened, surrendered, eventually discovers that it was never watching alone. This is nepsis, watchfulness, not anxious hyper-introspection, but a sober, quiet attentiveness to what moves within. held in the presence of the one, of God, who knows us better than we know ourselves. You see, it's all about awareness. That's what contemplation is, after all. Anything that you do, whether it's centering prayer, whether it is sensory walks, and all the other things that we've discussed, it's about developing the awareness to be able to see your thoughts, to realize that you are not the thoughts, that you are a deeper self. And that self has the capacity to be completely and fully present without any defense to the presence of God that is imbued in everything that we experience. And so this awareness that we're developing through these years of contemplative practice and spiritual formation is awareness of our thoughts and the thought process, but it's also awareness of awareness itself. It causes us to question, what is awareness? What is consciousness? What is it that we're doing? And as soon as we can do that, as soon as we can step back and be aware of our thoughts and aware of our awareness, that's the key that unlocks everything that follows. It's the key that unlocks balance, spiritual balance that we talk about so much. It's the key that unlocks emotional regulation. How can we regulate our emotions if we don't realize that our thoughts are taking us to places that we don't have to go? But if you lean in further, then that awareness merges with the other. And that other larger awareness that is God's, that permeates everything, we begin to see ourselves mirrored in others, mirrored in God. That's the identification that is love. But this is the progression. This is what needs to happen. And it all starts with awareness. And this is what Jesus is teaching. This is what his ministry is really about. And he tells us it requires stripping off everything that the ego attaches to, everything that the ego identifies with. Because as long as we're attached and identified to these things, then we are not aware of the deeper presence that is within us, ours and God's, and the deeper presence that is in everyone around us. And this is why Jesus does deconstruct Second Temple Judaism, first century Judaism. But he doesn't deconstruct all of it. He's not tossing it all, of course. He is a good Jew to the end. He deconstructs, he strips off only what is necessary to reclaim awareness. Not any more, not any less. And this is why we must deconstruct 21st century Christianity, but only what's necessary. The trouble is when we start deconstructing Christianity, we tend to want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We want to throw it all out. We say it's all corrupt. We don't make any kind of discernment, any kind of distinctions. But Jesus knows exactly how far to go. This much is necessary for us to reclaim our awareness. This much is necessary for us to be able to see ourselves as God sees us, to see ourselves mirrored in the presence of others. We don't need to toss the rest. And it's finding that line that is so key for us. And so this is what we've been doing as we have been studying Jesus as a first century Jew, as a mystic, as a contemplative. It's what we've been doing as we've been trying to establish our own contemplative practice in our lives. And so this is what we're doing right now in looking at these principles again, looking at these 6 pairs of words that we won't understand until we put them back into the Aramaic agreement. And that Aramaic agreement is simply the agreement that a people made, not just about language and the meaning of words, but about their whole society, their culture, their sense of history, their sense of being, their worldview, everything in that agreement, how they live together, how they understand living together, is reflected in their language and reflected in the words that they use, the idiomatic phrases that they speak. And until we understand those, then we're not going to understand what these words mean. And worse, we're going to think we understand because they're translated for us into English, and we're going to be running down the wrong paths. As I said, last time we talked about mercy and justice, and today we want to talk about law and effect. Because we totally misunderstand law. Because we look at it as an absolute instrument. We look at it as the laws that we have imposed upon us. our civil code, if you will. Those are absolute. They demand obedience. And if they don't get obedience, then they are going to punish us for that. And so it automatically puts us in a reward and punishment model. And as long as we are in that model, then we are living in fear. Fear of punishment. And the hope for some sort of reward if we perform well. And as long as we're living in that fear, then we can't live in love. It's perfect love that casts out the fear. And so we look at law that way. But the Torah, actually, Torah in Hebrew, doesn't mean law in the way we think of it. It literally means instruction. It means guidance. It's the hand at the small of your back that is guiding you where you need to go so that you don't get lost. And the relationship that we have with God is in the micro. Law is a macro instrument. It's necessary for the group. The group must have rules. The group must have justice in order to exist. But our relationship with God is in the micro. And we talked about last time that love looks like mercy in the micro, looks like justice in the macro. But our relationship with God is characterized by mercy and compassion. It's characterized by love and affection. Our mistake is going to be, if we look at law in the way that we typically do, that we can somehow obey our way into kingdom. We can obey our way into God's approval. We can obey the rules into kingdom, as Jesus calls it. But that's not possible. We think somehow we can obey our way into being born again. But all of these images that Jesus gives us, being born again, kingdom, are talking about an inside-out transformation, not an outside-in confirmation. It doesn't work that way. And Jesus knows that. But even so, he's not here to abolish the law. The law is necessary for the group. The law only for the group, but the law is necessary, as we're going to talk about, to establish the structure and the discipline that each one of us needs to be able to start walking down this path to reclaim our awareness as well. But Jesus deconstructs what is necessary to reclaim our awareness. And that is what he is doing. Take a look at Matthew 5, starting at verse 17. We've hit this verse quite a bit, but there's always so much more in it. Do not think that I came to abolish the law and the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law until all is accomplished. Now, when we read that in English, it looks very, very macro, doesn't it? It looks very absolute. Until heaven and earth pass away, and we're thinking about the end of the world. We're thinking about, apocalyptic end times. Until the heavens roll up like a scroll, the earth, the law is going to be there, and we're going to have to be obedient to it. But that's the problem with reading it outside of the Aramaic agreement. To pass away in Hebrew, the word here is abar. And abar means to cross a boundary or to merge. What Jesus is saying, until heaven and earth merge together. And what did they understand about heaven and earth? Heaven, the place of unity and complete oneness. Earth, the place of diversity and individual form and function. Until those merge in our hearts. Until we can see that all is one, even as we live a life of diversity, we're going to need the law to instruct and guide us. But once that merging has taken place in our hearts, once heaven and earth coexist there, once we see everything as one and identify with it, we don't need the law anymore. It can disappear, and we will continue living as if the law were the most important thing in our lives, because we will live it automatically. We will live that kind of respect and decency for each other and for the group. And so this idea of Jesus fulfilling, not here to abolish, he's here to fulfill, is stripping everything back to its original intent. And the original intent of the law is to, one, preserve life. That's what the law is about, preserving the life of the group. And secondly, to bring back and reclaim the awareness of God's presence in every waking moment. I suppose every sleeping moment too. But the law is set. If you look at the law and all the injunctions there, all the little things that they had to do, they're either preserving life, as in the dietary codes, or they are making us aware of God's presence, even down to the way we tie the threads on our tassels of our prayer shawls. Everything was regulated to do those two things. And yet they're all tied back to a bar. Ultimately, the law is going to be fulfilled in the experience of that oneness, of that unity with God. And so the law is needed until that moment. Until that moment we experience that oneness. Until it becomes a part of our lives. And then the law can disappear into that unity of God's will and our will. God's pleasure and deepest purpose is now become our pleasure and deepest purpose. And then how are we restricted by the law anymore? So how then are we supposed to view the law? How do we do that? I wanted to read just a little bit from the Fifth Way and see if this can put a finer point on it. By this point, it may seem fair to assume that kingdom exists in the micro to foster compassion and mercy, while the law is an instrument of the macro to ensure justice. In reality, the relationship between kingdom and law is not so dualistic or bipolar. It's much more connected and beautiful. Far from being separate forces working in different spheres, or a succession of forces, one superseding the other. Kingdom and Torah law are really exactly the same thing as viewed from opposite sides of the micro-macro divide. Law begins its work in the macro and filters into the micro, into the lives of individuals under the law. And kingdom begins in the micro, in the heart of each individual, and then breaks forth into the macro. Or, alternately, law and kingdom can be viewed simply as a cause and its effect. Looked at this way, kingdom does not supersede Torah law. Law is the cause, and kingdom is its effect. But then in the same way, the effect of kingdom is to fulfill the law, to make our lives look like law, but without the need for obedience. Because the effect of law is not obedience, it's kingdom, if we're viewing this correctly. And the effect of kingdom is freedom, but not anarchy. Freedom from obedience and freedom from restriction, but we still are living the code that keeps the community intact, keeps us decent to each other, keeps us all in God's reign, in God's unity, until we look like law fulfilled in our lives and in our awareness of presence. It's a complete circle. God's deepest purpose and desire, his pleasure and delight, is distilled down into the behavioral code of the law as mamlaka, that dictatorial macro rule for the people to obey. But law only becomes fulfilled as it becomes kingdom, malkuth, in those individuals who find their way to write the law on their hearts, to desire exactly what God desires. Then as kingdom malkuth breaks force from those transformed hearts in the micro, it expands outward, ultimately fulfilling law in the macro community, making obedience obsolete by turning mamlaka back into malkuth, the pleasure and purpose of God from whom it came. So law is always going to be necessary in the macro. But in the micro, until heaven and earth merge in our hearts and transform us and cause us to be born again, the law is there to instruct and guide us, keep us within the guardrails, within that structure and discipline that is so important for us. I've used this analogy before, but if you're hearing it for the first time, good. My jokes are new. Y'all know what a Jell-O mold is? Okay, you got the two halves of the thing, you put it together, and you pour the liquid Jell-O in there. And if you keep it there long enough, eventually you can pull away the mold, and the Jell-O now looks exactly like the mold. This is what the law is. The law is like a Jell-O mold. We pour our lives into the law, and if we hold it there long enough, eventually we can pull away the law, pull away the mold, and we now look like the law. It is the living of that structure, the living, being disciplined to that structure over time, that does the forming in us. Without that structure, everything is random. Without that structure, nothing really happens. but without the heart animating it from the inside. Remember about Keva and Kavana we talked about last time, the two aspects of prayer. The Keva is the structured part. The Kavana is the spontaneous, passionate part. Obviously, we need both. But the idea is we become the law. We are molded by the law. We're no longer following the law. Remember the movie Fahrenheit 451? Remember that one? The whole idea is that that is the temperature at which paper burns. Fahrenheit 451, right? 451 degrees Fahrenheit. And so this was said in the future when books were outlawed by the state. Could not own a book, right? And if they found a book, they would burn it. Fahrenheit 451. So what did the people do who were treasuring their books and wanted to preserve them? They went off into their own enclave out in the off-grid places, and they memorized the books, completely memorized the books. In fact, they lost their own names. They became the name of the book that they were memorizing, whether it was Moby Dick or Anne of Green Gables or whatever it happened to be. And then they were constantly teaching the children their books so that the books would be preserved. They became the book. We need to become the book. We need to become the law. That's the way all of this works. And if we're just following it out there as some objective thing to do, God loves us just the same. But we're not in kingdom. We're still living in fear. And we will not understand what Jesus is trying to get us to see about life, the freedom that can be had here. Continuing in the book, at Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God. The Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. These words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your sons, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." In molding the people, Torah regulated every aspect of Hebrew life. From the moment the people arose in the morning to the moment they lay down at night, almost every moment in between contained a command. What they wore, what they ate, how they prepared what they ate, how they fashioned the objects of worship, when and how they worshipped, how they related to each other, when they prayed, and how they prayed. The very tassels on their prayer shawls were knotted to match the numerical equivalents of the letters of the name of God. A contemporary Jew says that even today there is a morning prayer of thanksgiving to God for returning their souls to them for another day. There are prayers before enjoying material pleasures such as eating or wearing new clothes. Prayers before performing ritual functions such as lighting candles or washing hands. Prayers to recite upon seeing anything unusual like a king, a rainbow, or a great tragedy. Prayers to say whenever something good or bad happens and before bed at night. All in addition to regularly scheduled prayers 3 times a day and those said at synagogue. Sound oppressive to you? Yeah? Restrictive? Only if viewed as regulation. Only if viewed as restriction. But think of it kind of like wearing school uniforms. Any of you have to wear school uniforms back in the day? You know? At first we hated it. Actually, as little kids, first graders, we didn't care. But later on, you know what it did? It totally freed you up from having to worry about what you wore. And not only that, it leveled the playing field. Every kid, rich, poor, anywhere in between, was all wearing the same thing. So there was none of the judgmental ideas going on, or people being ostracized because they didn't have the right shoes or this or that. When I was in the monastery and contemplating moving forward as a religious, we would have eventually taken the habit, the blacks, the Roman collar, and so on and so forth. It's getting to be probably 10 years ago. I was at a seminar, and there was a Methodist pastor there. It was a bunch of pastors. There's a Methodist pastor there who was wearing the blacks, and he didn't have to wear the blacks, you know. But to him, it was really freeing because he knew what he was going to wear every single day, all the time, and he didn't have to think about it. And not only that, he said, if you wear this on a hospital visit, you get free parking. Yeah. Freedom! How are you going to view these restrictions? How are you going to view these rules? You can view them as oppressive, and you can chafe under them. Or you can see what they're trying to do. You can see what the intent is and why they're there. And you can let them unburden you. You can let them free you up. James calls the law of liberty. Talk about an oxymoron, huh? But he knows that once you have been transformed, once you've spent enough time in the Jell-O mold, it's freedom. It is a liberation. It's an unburdening. And you finally, once these rules are in your muscle memory and you don't have to think about them anymore, they're just a part of who you are. They flow out of you. Now you are free to pray without ceasing. There's the clutter that's gone. All of the contradiction is gone, right? The self-interest that would be pulling you away from the things you knew, all of that is gone. And you're free to move into a constant awareness, which is exactly where we're trying to get, where Jesus is trying to take us. This constant awareness, this presence, this merging of heaven and earth, that is kingdom. That's what Jesus is talking about when he talks about kingdom. It is the awareness of the oneness of everything amid and in the midst of the chaos and the complexity and the contradiction of daily life. How do we merge those two? Well, that awareness is only going to come with practice. You're not just going to be able to think it and do it. You're going to have to grind it out day by day at first. It's this daily growing of awareness. We talked about how awareness slowly catches up to you, aware of things in the past and then catches up into real time. And so this law that we're talking about is a top-down, outside-in structure and discipline that we are supposed to conform to. It's a boot camp for building our awareness because we are showing up to it every day. And if we're doing it seriously, it is bringing us more aware. Every time you prepared a meal in the kosher way as a Jew, it was reminding you of God's presence in that moment. Every time you fasted, every time you refrained from certain foods that others were eating, it was reminding you. Why do we do these things in our own culture? Because they remind us. They bring the presence back into the moment. Jesus is not abolishing any of this, but he is showing us how to graduate that simple and mere obedience all the way to be able to fulfill the intent of the law. Because as we said, once that law is muscle memory, then we're free to engage the bottom-up, inside-out practice of presence. We've been unburdened from all the lower-level tasks that need to be done, and now we can float above those and bring in the practice of presence. Now, how do we do that? How do we graduate obedience? Well, we're going to need to deconstruct. We're going to need to strip away whatever is necessary to reclaim our awareness. No more, no less. We do need to get beyond blind obedience. We need to get beyond the fear of punishment. We need to get beyond compromising God's love, which all of those absolutely do. Now, Jesus himself never broke the written law, the actual laws that were written into the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. How do we know that? Because it's not stated there. One of the reasons we know that is because the Pharisees would never have even given him the time of day if they viewed him as someone who stood outside the law. In fact, there's many scholars who believe that Jesus may have been a Pharisee, or at least trained in one of the Havirot. The Pharisees would look for promising boys, and then they would bring them into their brotherhood, into the Havirot, which were teaching schools. Jesus was highly educated. He was able to read and write the scriptures. He understood certain things. And he is as close to the Pharisees, or closer to the Pharisees, than any of the other schools of Jewish thought at the time. If he hadn't been keeping the law, if he wasn't part of the law, if they didn't see him that way, they never would have approached him. They never would have talked to him. They never would have had anything to do with him. But we see the Pharisees, especially at first, trying to understand and see what he's about, and the enmity eventually grows because Jesus disagreed not with the written law, he disagreed with the oral tradition. The oral tradition was the tradition of unwritten rules that the Pharisees in their school over a period of almost 300 years had introduced into the system as hedges against the written laws. All these thousands of other rules. And the problem was that that they eventually began to subvert the intent of the law in the first place. They became more important than the written law. They certainly became more important than the intent of the law, which was to preserve life and bring the awareness of God's presence back into focus. And so Jesus went out of his way to break the oral tradition at every turn, because that's what he was trying to do. He was trying to show how it subverted the intent of the law. And he was trying to break the legalistic mindset that had crept into Judaism over the centuries and the absolute corruption of the system. This is how the Pharisees had their power over the people as the lawyers of their day. And Jesus knew he wanted to bring the people back to the awareness of God's love. And so he used the Sabbath especially as a classroom, as a proving ground for being able to make his point, bring his point home, and show the people how they could reclaim awareness. Let's take a look at a few of those Sabbath controversies and see how they work, because it's fascinating to see Jesus here at work. At Matthew 12, starting at verse 1, at that time Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples became hungry and began to pick the heads of grain and eat. But when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples do what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." But he said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he became hungry, he and his companions? How he entered the house of God, and they ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those with him, but for the priests alone? Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and are still innocent? But I say to you that something greater than the temple is here. But if you had known what this means, I desire compassion and not a sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Now the truth of the matter is that Deuteronomy 23 allows anyone who's walking through a field and is hungry to pluck the grains and eat them. They can't use a sickle to do it. They can only use their hands, and they have to eat whatever they pick on the spot. So they can't gather and take it home to be stored. But what's the point? The point is to preserve life, to keep people comfortable and moving forward, even on the Sabbath. And so when Jesus' friends are doing this on the Sabbath, they're not breaking any written rule. But as soon as they took the head of the grain and they rubbed off the chaff in order to get to the grain itself, then they were breaking the oral tradition of winnowing. You couldn't do that. And so that's why they are so upset. But the intent here is to preserve life. And Jesus' larger point, that the Sabbath is made for man, to bring a rest at the end of the week, not the man made for Sabbath. And that the temple serves the people, not the other way around. It's all common sense. Take a look at Matthew 12. Departing from there, he went into their synagogue. And a man was there whose hand was withered. And they questioned Jesus, asking, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" so that they might accuse him. And he said to them, "What man is there among you who has a sheep? And if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will he not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable, then, is a man than a sheep? So then it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." And then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and it was restored to normal, like the other. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him on how they might destroy him. What Jesus is arguing here is called the Kal V'chomer argument that the rabbis knew very well. It's called light and heavy. If this is true in the light instance, how much more is it true in the other instance? And so Jesus says, hey, if you'll take your sheep out of a pit on the Sabbath, why wouldn't you do something for a human being who is much more valuable? And again, he healed with a word. So there was no breaking of the written law, but the oral tradition, they said that you could only heal on the Sabbath to save a life. But if it was a non-threatening injury or a non-life-threatening ailment, you couldn't do it. You couldn't even set a bone fracture. You couldn't move a dislocation back into position. You couldn't grind meds. That was also against the law for them to take the pain away or to help. You couldn't even pour cold water on a dislocation to take away the pain. But they did say you can wash it. And if it heals, it heals. Crazy. And Jesus is calling all of this into attention. John 5:5, a man was there who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time in that condition, he said to him, "Do you wish to get well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I'm coming, another steps down before me." And Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your pallet, and walk." Immediately the man became well, picked up his pallet, and began to walk. Now it was the Sabbath on that day. Again, it's not a life-threatening injury. He had been there for 38 years, right? So on that face, it broke the oral tradition. But also, Jesus healed with the word. It was not against the law. But then he said, "Pick up your pallet and walk." And as soon as he did that, he was breaking the oral tradition again, which said that you couldn't carry any burden more than 4 cubits in a public space. And a cubit is from your elbow to your fingertips. So that's not very far. And here he was. Here's Jesus again breaking the oral tradition on purpose to show why we are doing what we're doing. And this last one, John 9, as he passed by on the Sabbath, he saw a blind man from birth. And his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would be born blind?" And Jesus answered, "It was neither this man who sinned nor his parents, but it was so that the works of God might be displayed in him." Skipping to verse 6. When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle and applied the clay to his eyes and said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which is translated sent. And so he went away and washed and came back seeing. Another Sabbath healing. But again, if Jesus had just healed with the word, it would have been completely lawful. But what did he do? He spit into his hand and he put dirt in there and he mixed it into a mud paste. As soon as he did that, he was kneading. He was building according to the oral tradition. That was unlawful on the Sabbath. Once again, there's an old toast that says, "Here's mud in your eye." Have you heard that one before? He was putting his finger in the eye of the Pharisees. He was putting mud in the eye of the man to heal him. But he was making a very, very strong point. And so we can ask again, how is it that we're supposed to view the law? The law, without the human heart, desiring God's purpose and presence in our daily lives, is useless. This is what Jesus is trying to get across. It's as useless as a musical instrument without the skilled fingers of a player to bring it to life. Without that, it might as well be a doorstop or a paperweight. The law is the same way. Here's what Jesus is teaching about the law. First, keeping the law meant fulfilling the intent of the law, not just following the code of the law. Second, that obedience and disobedience are inward states of our heart and our being, not mere conformance. Third, outward obedience, conformance, means nothing if the heart is not right. And that went for the rituals as well. We call them sacraments. And we always say a sacrament is just an outward expression of an inward transformation. Without the inward transformation, without the consecrated heart to the ritual, it means nothing. Jesus is trying to reorder the way the people thought about the law so the law could start doing its job again, which was bringing them in to reclaim their awareness. Deeper, revering and keeping the law is critical for creating that jello mold effect, the structure and the discipline that each one of us need, not in the macro, but in the micro. Building that muscle memory of decent care of others and of our community, allowing us the freedom to be able to pray always, constantly. But if we're stuck in blind obedience, in the fear of punishment, we can't reclaim our awareness. We will be always underneath that glass ceiling. To graduate obedience is to look beyond the rules to intent, which is always to preserve life and become aware of presence. And not just the external law that we've been talking about, but our own unconscious beliefs that we were talking about at the beginning that seem just as unbreakable to us, Maybe even more so because we don't even realize the hold that they have over us. And like Jesus, we must begin to question all these beliefs, question these rules, see if they are actually functioning in our lives as they should be, and not just blindly follow them because someone else told us we should. What does love actually require of us in this particular situation? And then the next one, what does love actually imply? And how do we get there? One final little bit. How does this capacity grow? We train our attention first. Attention is the muscle beneath awareness. Attention is the muscle beneath awareness. Contemplative prayer, breath awareness, silent walks, these are not merely calming. They are attention training. Sit in silence for 10 minutes and notice what happens to the mind. How quickly it wanders, rehearses, defends, escapes. Just seeing this is already growth. Awareness begins with noticing how unaware you usually are. Name your thoughts rather than becoming them. Instead of I'm a failure, try I'm having the thought that I'm a failure. That small linguistic gap creates enormous psychological space. You are no longer inside the thought, you are in relationship to it. Question what arrives with force. Not every thought deserves obedience. Ask, is this actually true? What wound in me might be speaking? What becomes possible if I hold this more loosely? This is where metacognition becomes discernment. Try writing reflectively. Many people do not know what they think until they write it down. Think about that. The journal externalizes the internal and makes patterns visible, recurring scripts, emotional loops, hidden assumptions that have been quietly governing decisions. What becomes visible can be engaged. What remains invisible simply runs. Practice the pause under pressure. The real formation happens in the changed conversation, the triggered moment. Before replying from activation, pause, breathe, ask what is actually moving in you. This is metacognition becoming character rather than technique, which is exactly when it matters most. And so in contemplation, we are training our attention as the first steps along this way of Jesus to reclaim our awareness, to reclaim a love that's going to cast out all the fear. Law is one tool that we use, but it's just a tool. It's not that absolute instrument. It is instruction or guidance. We think that it demands our obedience. It demands our attention, but it needs to instruct us. It is not a standard by which God approves us or not, loves us or not, depending on how well we perform. It is the foundation upon which we are going to build our own practice of presence. And that law remains in force until we reclaim our awareness and thereby remember who we really are. That's the freedom that Jesus has for us. Let's pray. So, Father, here we are. We're a mix of all the things that we have experienced, the things that we have learned, the things that we have believed, chosen to believe, or were taught to believe before we could make a choice. All those things are in us right now. Help us to walk down this path with you and become more and more aware of everything that is happening, that is affecting our choices, affecting our relationships, affecting our ability to rest in you and your love and escape the fear that has characterized most of our lives and most of human life. We want to break free. We want to feel what it means to be completely immersed in your presence. Help us to take those steps, Lord. Help us to find the initiative to be disciplined to a structure that either we set for ourselves or accept from someone else, from you. but help us to do the work that we need to do to get to where we want to be with you. Thank you, Father, for your love, your affection. Never let us forget we can only love because you loved us first. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's all stand.